Hello?
Hi again.
Hi. Sorry, my meeting with the students ran a little bit late because I couldn't access the Zoom link because it kept saying I needed a password.
Yeah, it's so funny because a student, I had invited like a group of students and one of them had sent me an email right before I got that email. And so it was the same with them. And to my knowledge, I don't create passwords for, I just, so I'm glad that you were able, so this is going to be a big problem. I mean, if you're not able to meet with the students, I'm glad that you were able to do that.
Yeah, they were so amazing and such a smart and enthusiastic bunch. So I'm really glad that I got a chance to meet them and talk about like their interests and what they want to see at CSU Stanislaus. Yeah, so yeah, I'm just gonna do some to make sure that I can share my screen and that I can share my sound for this video that I'm gonna play for my teaching demo.
So I'm going to make you a co-host, and please go ahead. I don't do personal meeting rooms. I have a particular way that I welcome students in, which is, I mean, this is totally fine because they see me doing this like when they log on. So yeah, I'm glad that the check-in with the students went well.
Okay. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay.
Oh, I'm excited. Oh yes.
All right, everything looks good. So I'm just gonna go to the, okay.
All right. Talked about yellow peril. I used that. I forget, like whatever they call. So primary source images, and this is great because we'll be covering this within the next few weeks.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'm just making sure that the image is clear and you can actually see it. Yes. I was worried about that.
Oh my God, this is so, oh, that's really powerful with the cat o' nine tails.
All the images are there.
Oh my God, I used that one too on the model minority. I love it. I love it. I feel very affirmed because you are an Asian American scholar, and so I feel really good that we're using her.
Yeah, so I'm just gonna see if we could hear the sound for this video.
So I'm sure that you already know this, but like, did you select the share screen option?
Oh, share sound?
Okay. Share sound.
Yeah, let me do that again too, because
and I usually double check.
Yeah, there it is. Share sound. All right. Ooh, to share your computer audio, please install the Zoom audio device. Oh, I remember now. I can't share screen. I can't share sound because my computer is 6 years old and I can't download the new Zoom.
Oh, okay.
So what
Okay, so what I do is
you can send me the video and I can queue it up, and then I can share. That's one option. I can share my screen when it's time to play the video.
Okay. Can I try this one thing? Could you hear it?
It's very muffled. Kind of.
All right. So I will send you the link.
Okay. Let me know. I'll be ready to queue it up. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Let me enter. Oh, I can enter my email address in the chat if you need it.
Yes. I can also just copy and paste the link in the chat if that's more
perfect. Perfect. No, that's even better.
All right. So here is the link
to
the video. Hopefully it's the right link.
I'll practice this. So what I'm going to do is, if you ended sharing screen. So I'm going to share my screen, check your computer sound, and then I would like to see if you can hear the video clearly.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear it.
Okay, I will go back to the beginning. Now, the tricky thing is I do have a student this who needs closed captioning. It has it already. I saw it. I just saw
Yeah,
it.
the
Okay.
video has a lot of captions and
Okay.
describes what's happening in detail. So it should be a good balance. Yeah, I tried to see if it had additional closed captioning options, but it didn't. So I apologize for
Oh, no. This is my first time. I mean, I've had students with accommodations and modifications, but my first time actually having, and the language is not non-dominant hearing.
Mhm.
And so this is the first time. And so it's definitely a learning curve. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm glad everything's working. Yeah, I'll be back around
Okay.
at 4:30 for the teaching demo. So I'll
Oh,
see you then.
great. Okay, I'll see you then.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Do you think you're better off alone?
Pizza or salad? Which one do you think I'm having for dinner tonight? Well, it's not this. It's definitely not.
Listen, baby, ain't no mountain high, ain't no valley low, ain't no river wide enough, baby.
If you need me, call me. No matter where you are, no matter how far.
Don't worry, baby.
Just call my name. I'll be there in a hurry. You don't have to worry. 'Cause baby, there ain't no mountain high enough. Ain't no valley low enough. Ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, baby.
Remember the day I set you free? I told you you could always count on me, darling. From that day on, I made a vow I'll be there when you want me, some way, somehow. Oh, baby,
There ain't no mountain high enough. Ain't no valley low enough. Ain't no river wide enough to keep me from getting to you, baby.
oh no, darling.
No wind, no rain, or winter's cold can stop me, baby.
No, no, baby.
'Cause you are my
If you're ever in
love.
trouble, I'll be there on the double. Just send for me, oh baby.
My love is alive, way down in my heart, although we are miles apart.
If you ever need a helping hand, I'll be there on the double, just as fast as I can. Don't you know that there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough
Keep me from getting to you, babe. Don't you know that there ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough, ain't no river wide enough, ain't no mountain high enough, ain't no valley low enough.
I see the crystal raindrops fall, and the beauty of it all is when the sun comes shining through to make those rainbows in my mind. When I think of you sometime, and I want to spend some time with you, just the two of us. We can make it if we try, just the two of us.
Just the two of us.
Just the two of us. look for love, no time for tears. Wasted water's all that is, and it don't make no flowers grow. Good things might come to those who wait, but not for those who wait too late. We gotta go for all we know. Just the two of us. We can make it if we try. Just the two of us.
Just the two of us.
Just the two of us. Building them castles in the sky. Just the two of us. You and I. I hear the crystal raindrops fall on the window down the hall, and it becomes the morning dew.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is 4:30, so we are going to get started. First of all, I just want to let you know I had so much fun putting together, compiling the playlist that you all created on the Google Doc form where I shared the link last week. And again, that is optional. And feel free to continue to add to the playlist. And before we segue into a brief overview of the assignment that you have for this week, connected with the first reading in the first unit, I am very excited to welcome MT Vallarta, who is one of our Asian American finalists for the Asian Americanist position in ethnic studies with an emphasis in Asian American studies. And they are going to be the guest teacher for today. And I was really excited to look at their presentation, and it totally aligns with what we are going to be doing a deeper dive into in the next couple of weeks. So without further ado, I am going to go ahead and make sure that I have MT have you set up with the co-hosting, and so that you can now share your screen and you can
Thank
get
you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. First and foremost, I just want to share that I was really happy to get to know you all a little bit, looking at your slides and photos and reading some of the fun facts that you have, and what your majors are. So thanks for sharing some of these facts about yourselves. I'm really excited to meet you all and to share some of my research with you. So let me share my screen. Can everybody see this?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So today, first and foremost, once I review this agenda, I am going to went ahead of myself. I'm going to introduce myself, and we're also going to talk about the word queer, what it means, what it represents, and we're also going to talk about this method or analytic called queer of color critique. We're going to learn a little bit about Asian American immigrant history in the United States. We're going to talk about this stereotype of the yellow peril, and then we're going to transition to the state of contemporary Asian America, what the model minority myth is. And then we're going to transition to a discussion. We're going to have you all watch this video about a contemporary issue in relation to this lecture. And hopefully, and then I'm also going to be answering some of your questions. But feel free to ask me questions throughout too, especially if there's something that you would like me to elaborate further or learn more about. So the name that I've given this lecture is What's Queer About Asian American Studies? And again, my name is MT. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am currently a PhD candidate in ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside. I'm in my final year. I'll be filing my dissertation this spring. So I'm really excited to graduate and take this next step in my academic career. So I first was introduced to Asian American studies when I was an undergrad at UC Berkeley. Asian American studies was actually one of the first classes that I took in my freshman year, and it really illuminated questions that I had about race and why Asian Americans were facing discrimination, even though the United States promotes itself as a country of liberty, democracy, and racial progress. But it was also during the time where I began to question and embrace my identity as a queer person. And I also started to think about, well, what does it mean to be queer and also be Asian American? Is queerness just being about LGBTQ plus, or is it so much more broad and expansive than that? So why Asian American studies? Asian Americans are one of the largest diasporic groups in the United States. According to the 2018 census, Asian Americans make up 22.6 million of the population. However, the first major wave of Asian immigration was in the mid-19th century. And I remember when I learned that fact in my Intro to Asian American Studies class, I was really blown away because I had thought that Asian Americans were fairly new immigrants to the United States, like my parents. My parents immigrated to the US in the 1980s. So I thought that immigration didn't begin until the late 20th century. So it was really eye-opening for me to learn that this immigration history extends, that the first major wave extends to the mid-19th century. And Asian American studies also teaches us that, immigration or immigration history is not just an issue about race, ethnicity, nationality, or class. Immigration is also regulated by conceptions of gender and sexuality. So the government, the state, also decides who is welcome here and who is not, based on how well these people fit into what's considered normal in regards to gender and sexuality. So before I continue with talking about what queer is, I'm really interested to see what you all think the definition of queer is. So if folks could take a few minutes to just type their thoughts and definitions about what they think the term queer means or illuminates, that would be great. Don't be afraid if you don't know what it means or you're still being introduced to queerness or queer studies. This is a learning opportunity for all of us. So if everyone could just take a few seconds to type that up in the chat, that would be great. And I will read everyone's thoughts out loud. Okay. So someone wrote, I'm not sure. That's totally fine. When I first heard the term queer, I wasn't sure either. So I know it's part of the LGBTQ community. Yes. It is like not conforming to traditional gender roles. Yes. Wow. Person with different characteristics than what is considered normal. Yes. A term used to describe sexual and gender identities. I think queer is pretty much an umbrella term for people part of the LGBT plus community. And then sexual and gender identities. So excellent. All of you are on the right track in regards to what the term queer means. So just to give you all a little bit of, just to share the etymology or the history of the word queer. So queer used to mean strange. It was an adjective used to describe people who were weird, who were not normal, who were deviating from society's norms. And at that time, in the 18th and in the 18th and 19th centuries, queer was just a word that people used to describe someone or something that was strange. And then it wasn't until homosexuality became criminalized during the Victorian era, and being homosexual was suddenly seen as a vice or a crime, that the term queer began to take on a more derogatory manner. So queer became a slur, an offensive word used against someone who is LGBTQ plus. But more recently, with the gay liberation and LGBT rights movement in the 70s and 80s, queer was reclaimed to create the spaces for open dialogue and the inclusion of non-normative genders and sexualities. And these definitions and quotes about the word queer come from this amazing book titled Queering Contemporary Asian American Art, edited by Laura Kina and Jan Christian Bernabe. And I love this anthology because Kina and Bernabe really break down how queer is more than an umbrella term or an identity category for LGBTQ+. The word queer in itself was reclaimed as an act of resistance to create the spaces for open dialogue and to include people who are not cisgendered, who are not heterosexual into this community. So that is the history and etymology of the word queer. So one of the words that is used in the previous slide is the term non-normative. So non-normative refers to not being normal, not being acceptable, being located outside what is considered normal and acceptable in a society. So in her essay, Age, Race, Class, and Sex, Women Redefining Difference, from the sister, you can find this essay in Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider anthology. Audre Lorde talks about how in addition to the structure of white supremacy, America is also organized around this idea of the mythical norm. And she defines the mythical norm as a person who is white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. It is with this mythical norm that the trappings of power reside within society. So Audre Lorde is arguing that in the United States, the normal citizen, the model citizen, the first person that we think about when we think American citizen is this mythical norm. Is usually a person who is white, thin, male, young, heterosexual, Christian, and financially secure. And it is this citizen who is able to possess all the rights and privileges that come with being a citizen of the United States, whereas those who are located outside of this mythical norm, people who aren't white, who aren't cisgender male, who aren't heterosexual, end up being called non-normative or even queer. So Audre Lorde is alluding to the fact that being outside the norm or being queer isn't just regulated to people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans or non-binary. People of color, people who are not Christian, the poor and working class have also been queer to the nation state, to the United States, because they do not fit the rubrics of this mythical norm. So with that, Bernabe and Kina demonstrate how we can use this analytical method called queer of color critique to better understand how it's not just LGBTQ plus people who are regulated and constrained and hurt by normativity. People who are located outside that mythical norm, who are part of different racial categories, different nationalities, and different religions, who are not white, who are not heterosexual, who are not Christian, have been located and socialized as queer because of their inability to fit into the United States. So the term queer of color critique was coined by a Black studies scholar, Roderick Ferguson, and it's an analytical method where queer is used as a verb for its broad critique of social antagonisms, including race, gender, class, nationality, and religion, including sexuality. So queer of color critique is about examining how people have been excluded, have been discriminated against, have been quote unquote queer to the United States because they are minoritized subjects that belong to these categories of social difference. So queer ineluctably produces queer bodies through its embrace of the non-normative. So queerness, again, doesn't just represent folks who are LGBTQ+, but rather non-normativity as a wider site of social violence. Queer of color critique is about examining how normativity hurts everyone outside of the mythical norm, regardless of their gender or sexuality. Are there any questions so far? Okay, thank you so much. So now we're going to transition. Now that I have introduced you all to queer and queer of color critique, I'm going to transition us to an overview of Asian immigration. So in one of the previous slides, I mentioned that the first major wave of Asian immigration was in the mid-19th century. And I'm going to be talking primarily about the Chinese American community, because not only are they one of the largest Asian immigrant groups as the United States, so the history of immigration and exclusion of Chinese folks in America actually set a precedent for other immigration exclusion acts and how other Asian and minority ethnic groups were treated after they migrated to the United States. So I'm going to start with Chinese Americans because their experience in the US really set a precedent to how our immigration system functions. So in 1848, the first Chinese gold miners arrived in San Francisco. By the 1850s, 1/5 of the miners by the Sierra Nevada foothills were Chinese. So a lot of Chinese folks ended up immigrating to the United States, not only to seek their fortune and strike it rich with the gold rush in California, but there was a lot of poverty and degradation in China at the time due to the Opium Wars that ravaged the country. So a lot of Chinese miners were looking to America in order to have a better life and seek that American dream. By the 1850s, alarmed by the large numbers of Chinese miners congregating together and fearing competition, an upsurge of white racism influenced the passage of the 1852 Foreign Miners Tax. That was a law that targeted Chinese miners to pay $3 a month. So I know $3 a month might not sound like a lot of money right now, but I actually did the inflation calculator, and $3 a month is now around $101 today. So that's a lot of money being siphoned off of the Chinese immigrant community. And this tax would actually become 50% of California's revenue at the time. So California was able to develop itself as an economy, as a state, on the backs of these vulnerable Chinese immigrants. And then poor whites began to see the Chinese immigrant community as competition for jobs. As a result, Chinese immigrants were restricted from joining labor unions and were seen as a threat to white job security. So during this first major wave of Asian immigration, there was also a wave of immigration coming primarily from Southern and Eastern Europe. So a lot of Southern and Eastern European immigrants were competing with Asian immigrants for some of these, for a lot of these manual labor jobs. So poor whites began to see Chinese immigrants as competition, as quote unquote stealing their jobs, taking what should be rightfully theirs. So as a result, this stereotype and discourse known as the yellow peril, which is portrayed in this political cartoon to the left, began to dominate the mainstream discourse about Chinese immigrants, about Asian immigrants. Not only were they seen as a threat to white job security, but Chinese men were also seen as a threat to white gender norms. So because there weren't a lot of jobs reserved for Chinese men, many of them were only given the option to work as launderers, domestic helpers, and other forms of reproductive labor or domestic work that was usually regulated toward women. So as a result, Chinese men were seen as not real men and were feminized and emasculated routinely and were seen as unworthy of being a part of the United States and unable to uphold normative ideas about what it means to be masculine or what it means to be a man, which was very, very important to the United States at the time, because the late 19th and early 20th century was also when the United States really wanted to depict itself as a world power. They wanted to show that they were Britain and Spain and all of these other, old world European countries that already had colonies around the world. They wanted to demonstrate that they were equal rivals to these European powers. So it was important for the United States to depict itself as masculine, as aggressive, as powerful. So Chinese men were seen as a hindrance to that desire, to that representative desire. So actually, I'm going to move myself to the bottom corner so you could see this image better. But this is an image from Harper's Weekly magazine, and it was published in 1869. So the caption at the bottom reads, "Pacific Chivalry, Encouragement to Chinese Immigration." I know that the caption in the back on the wall of that shed might be difficult to read, so I'm going to read it out loud. It says, "Courts of justice closed to Chinese, extra taxes to yellow jacks." So that caption on the shed is actually is an allusion to the foreign miners tax that I talked about earlier. So in this political cartoon, we have these two figures. On the left, we have this racialized caricature of a Chinese immigrant. So this figure, if you peer closely into his face has this very animalistic, non-human facial features, and with a nose that almost looks like a snout, almost pig-like. And his queue is currently braid is currently being tugged by this second figure, who represents the rugged white laborer or white frontiersman. So the figure of the Chinese immigrant, in addition to the animalistic, non-human facial features, they're also wearing a blouse with billowing bell-like sleeves and trousers that look almost like a skirt that are also billowing. and they have dainty little feet in what appear to be slippers. And in contrast to that, we have the white labor / white frontiersman holding a whip or cat o' nine tails. And he has a hat on his head, and on the brim, you can see that it's labeled California. He is wearing work pants, work shirts. On his waistband, there is a holster there for a gun, and he's also wearing rugged leather boots. So you can see a big contrast between this image of the Chinese immigrant and this image of the white laborer / white frontiersman. Um, the the Chinese immigrant also looks really out of place in his outfit, whereas the white laborer / white frontiersman in his rugged boots and work pants and work shirt, it looks like he fits into the background, right, with the railroad and the mountains and the trees. So the white frontiersman's image alone demonstrates how he is not only preventing the yellow peril from coming to the United States, from stealing all the jobs, he's also protecting what is rightfully his, the frontier, expansion of the United States from the Midwest to the Pacific. So the Chinese immigrant has no place, is foreign and undesirable in that vision of American expansion. And that is made apparent even more with the fact that the white frontiersman is holding the Chinese immigrant's queue in his hands, and he's getting ready to whip him with the cat o' nine tails. And the description at the bottom also states Pacific chivalry, and chivalry is a term that describes honor, a knight's code to defend the security and sanctity of the nation. So preventing the yellow peril from being a part of the United States, from being a part of this vision of American expansion, was the duty of the white labor, of the white frontiersman. And the Chinese immigrant was not welcome, not only because he was stealing jobs, but because he is so different and so incapable of subscribing to this hyper masculine, aggressive gender norm that this white frontiersman represents. So this image would later be circulated and used to promote the exclusion of Chinese immigrants from the United States. Are there any questions so far? I'm gonna check the chat box. No questions? All right, thank you all. So with that, the idea of the yellow peril isn't just a racial stereotype. It also has to do with the regulation of gender and sexual norms. So in her book, Arresting Dress, scholar Claire Sears talks about how the political cartoon that I showed you in the previous slide, it does feature caricatures of Chinese men that center on their ostensibly feminine appearance. We saw the visual cues such as the long hair, the rich billowing gowns, and we see this portrayal of Chinese men as effeminate and deviant. And Sears argues that these images were used to justify exclusion of Chinese immigrants and demonstrate that they are unworthy of performing normative masculinity, of being real men, and are thus unworthy of being included in the United States. So Claire Sears demonstrates how we can use queer of color critique to show how exclusion of Chinese immigrants wasn't just about race, it wasn't just about class, it was also about concerns regarding their non-normative genders and sexualities. And Chinese women too were not exempt from this discrimination and from these exclusion laws. So in the previous image that I showed on my slide in Asian immigration, we can see this photograph of Chinese miners in San Francisco from the mid 19th century. And you can see that in this photo, almost all of them were men. So there is this perception in Asian American studies that Asian women were not in the United States during this time, but they were. Chinese women in particular mostly were mostly trafficked and immigrated to the United States as prostitutes because there weren't a lot of jobs available for Chinese women at the time. And a lot of job contractors saw Chinese women as a exploitable population. So a large number of Chinese women immigrated and were trafficked to the United States as prostitutes. This is actually a photo from the National Women's History Museum that portrays a Chinese prostitute in San Francisco awaiting her clientele in a small pen. So Chinese prostitutes at the time didn't just serve Asian men or Chinese men, they also had white clients. And because so many white men were coming to these Chinese women, and Chinese folks were stereotyped as the yellow peril, seen as these figures or beings full of vice, full of disease. Chinese women in particular were stereotyped as being full of sexually transmitted diseases. They were seen as a threat to the sexual purity and morality of white men, that associating with a Chinese woman having sexual relations with a white woman would lead to the degradation of the white race. And it was also seen as a white man's betrayal to white women, to the white race. So in 1875, the United States passed this piece of legislation known as the Page Law. And this quote right here to the left is actually borrowed verbatim from the text of the law itself. So it states that any subject from China, Japan, or Oriental country that enters the United States for lewd and immoral purposes will be excluded from entering the nation. And even though there were Chinese women and Asian women who migrated to the United States that were not prostitutes, this led to to Asian women being stereotyped as sexually promiscuous, deviant, and vile figures. So even though every Asian woman was in the United States was assumed to be a prostitute because of the precedent and the stereotypes established by this law. So Asian women were seen as unworthy of being included in the United States because they were supposedly sexually promiscuous and sexually deviant people. So the 1875 Page Law actually set the precedent for the passage of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So it was a federal act that barred Chinese laborers from entering the United States. And it currently remains the first and only law that targeted a specific racial and ethnic group from immigrating to the United States. And it led to the passage of several other exclusion laws intent on stopping Asian immigration to the United States. So after the Chinese Exclusion Act passed, the United States passed the Gentlemen's Agreement, which barred Japanese folks from immigrating to the United States. They passed the 1917 Asiatic Barred Zone Act that expanded these restrictions to countries like India. So it's learning about the Chinese Exclusion Act is really important because it set the precedent for immigration exclusion and also set the foundation to our xenophobic immigration system today. And the Chinese Exclusion Act actually wasn't repealed until 1943, not until World War II. And its legacy and its impact remains today. So what did we learn so far about queer of color critique and Asian immigration history? So we learned that Chinese immigrants were not only excluded from the US because of their race and ethnicity, but also because of their transgression of gender norms. So when we think about issues of immigration, who is included or excluded from the United States, we can't just think about race, ethnicity, or nationality. We also need to look at how gender and sexuality also creates exclusion and discrimination and makes people queer or undesirable and foreign to the United States. So by using queer as a verb, as queer of color critique, queer of color critique helps us identify how non-white others were stereotyped as strange, deviant, and queer on the basis of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and thus unworthy of being a part of the United States. So queer of color critique is a really useful framework, a really useful analytical method to help us gain a more intersectional and more holistic understanding of American history. So how can we use queer of color critique to understand contemporary Asian American issues today? So Yellow Peril generated, in the late 19th, early 20th century, but what are some other stereotypes or issues that Asian Americans continue to contend with today? Well, one of them is the model minority myth. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this myth and have heard about it before. This is a Time magazine cover from August 31st, 1987. I feel really old just reading that date out loud, but yeah, this magazine cover really does a good job of illustrating visually what the model minority myth is. And there's the caption under Time reads, "Those Asian American whiz kids." So the model minority myth is the belief that Asian Americans as a group have managed to achieve economic, political, and cultural success despite racial adversity. So despite years of immigration exclusion and discrimination and racialized violence, Asian Americans have become model minorities, have become successful professionals with lucrative careers, have stable families and houses and really good jobs. And it's this belief that all Asians are academically successful, financially secure, high achieving, and high functioning. And this stereotype increased in popularity after the passage of the 1965 Immigration Act. So that was an act that essentially reversed all of the restrictions with the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Page Law, the Gentleman's Agreement, and all of these other exclusion acts. And that act also prioritized the immigration of Asian professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, graduate students, and also family reunification. So suddenly, the Asian American community shifted from being a predominantly bachelor community comprised mostly of single men working jobs in manual labor to this really vibrant and seemingly affluent professional community with two-parent households, mother, father, and kids. And this stereotype was also circulated and popularized during the civil rights movement. So during this time, Black, Indigenous, and people of color were fighting for equality, equity, and abolition of policing and other structures of violence. And the Black community in particular was very, very vocal about how the United States is founded on a legacy of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So a lot of government officials and intellectuals began to, while the civil rights movement and Black Power movements were happening, they also began to see these large populations of Asian Americans succeeding professionally, doing well in school, Asian Americans that appear to be high achieving and high functioning, despite all of the political and racial unrest in the country. And they came to the conclusion that they came to the conclusion that white supremacy wasn't a problem if this minority group that was previously discriminated upon, that faced exclusion and violence because of their race, is now able to succeed and have this vibrant, affluent community. That must mean that Black, Indigenous, and all of these people of color that are protesting are just upset and are unable to lift themselves up from their bootstraps. So that's how the model minority myth functioned. This also coincided with, I also mentioned that the model minority myth led to the emergence of the shift from suddenly having bachelor communities, mostly comprised of single Asian men, to suddenly having these solid two-parent family structures. And this is a quote that I took from an NPR article titled "Model Minority Myth Again Used as a Racial Wedge," NPR. So Andrew Sullivan is a political commentator, and he states that today, Asian Americans are among the prosperous, well-educated, and successful ethnic groups in America. What gives? It couldn't be that they maintained solid two-parent family structures, had social networks that looked after one another, placed enormous emphasis on education, hard work, and thereby turned false negative stereotypes into true positive ones, could it? So this, I put the part about Asian Americans supposedly being successful because they maintain solid two-parent family structures in bold, because when we talked about Audre Lorde's idea of the mythical norm, about how the ideal, acceptable, normal American citizen is someone who is white, middle class, straight, and cisgender male, that also includes what the ideal model and normal family looks like. And as I'm sure all of you know, the nuclear family remains the normative unit of socialization, of kinship, that is promoted and expected of us as people to strive to attain when we grow up and get a job and eventually get married. So this comment by Andrew Sullivan draws attention to the fact that having a nuclear family is also a part of that mythical norm, and that Asian Americans are supposedly model minorities because they were able to have these solid two-parent family structures, a mom, a dad, kids, a dog, and white picket fence, despite the hardship and violence that they initially faced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And this idea of Asian Americans having solid two-parent family households was used in contrast to the commentary and stereotypes about Black families. So in 1963, this man, that's his image right there, Daniel P. Moynihan, who was a sociologist, he published this report called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. And one of the questions that he was tackling in this study was, why are so many Black people living in poverty? And in this study, he concluded that poverty in these communities was the result of the high rate of families headed by single Black mothers, in contrast to the Asian families that had solid two-parent family structure. So Moynihan and all of his buddies painted poverty as a culture, as a behavioral issue, rather than a socioeconomic and racialized one. So not only did the Moynihan report and the model minority myth tokenize Asian Americans and use them as a wedge against Black communities, this idea of poverty happening in the Black community because of the high rate of single Black mothers was used to justify the state's abandonment of Black families, of Black youth, of Black women, and rather than getting to the actual root of the problem, which was a legacy of anti-Blackness and white supremacy that has historically disenfranchised Black communities. So this is how the model minority myth was actually used to hurt and perpetuate further harm on Black communities. So as a result, with this overview of model minority myth and queer of color critique, we can use queer of color critique to decipher how the model minority myth is not just a stereotype based in racial and ethnic assumptions, but it's also based on the mythical norm, the idea that Asian Americans are successful because they have maintained solid and stable two-parent family households. So the model minority myth isn't just about all Asians are smart, or all Asians are gonna grow up and have successful jobs, or all Asians are high functioning and can do all of this work despite how tired they are. The model minority myth is also about maintaining normativity. It's a way to demonstrate to other Black, Indigenous, and Brown folks and other people of color that the problem here in the United States isn't white supremacy. It's the fact that these communities are failing and refusing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, unlike the Asians do. So that's what the model minority myth reveals. And then queer of color critique helps us also highlights the issues and struggles Asian Americans still face despite being stereotyped as model minorities. So the model minority myth also invisibilizes the continued struggle and the racialized violence Asian communities are facing. Around 12% of the Asian American population lives in poverty. A lot of and even though Asian American families are touted as being stable, two-parent family households, there's actually a lot of domestic abuse and intergenerational trauma in Asian families. And right now with COVID-19, a lot of Asian folks are facing violence because of the supposed origins of the coronavirus in China. So the model minority myth shrouds the fact that Asian Americans continue to be a minority group that is harmed by racialized violence and white supremacy. And then finally, the model minority myth is an example of an ideology that is rooted in anti-Blackness. So not only is it a divide and conquer technique that separates Asians and Black communities and prevents them from forging alliances and solidarities with one another, the model minority myth act also criminalizes the Black community and indoctrinates Asian Americans into upholding an anti-Black discourse. So a lot of Asian Americans who believe that the model minority myth is positive, who believe that it's true that white supremacy isn't a problem, it's just this culture of poverty or lack of motivation that other minority groups face, they are actually engaging in an anti-Blackness discourse that was used to justify abandonment and violence towards the Black community. So it's really important to understand how the model minority myth is connected to these larger stakes and consequences. So with that, here are some keywords that we learned today with this lecture. We learned about queer of color critique, how it's an important analytical method that can help illuminate how difference and exclusion don't just operate on the basis of race and ethnicity or nationality, but also on gender and sexuality. We learned about Audre Lorde's conception of the mythical norm, how the ideal citizen in America is someone who's white, middle class, cisgender, male, and heterosexual. We learned about the yellow peril and model minority myth stereotypes and how the yellow peril stereotype led to the exclusion of Asian immigrants in the United States. And we learned how the model minority myth is actually a tool of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. So I want to give you all an opportunity to engage with some media on queer of color critique and Asian American studies. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen right now because I have a very old computer. It is around 6 years old, and so the video can't play. But what I'm going to do is I'm gonna copy and paste the discussion question into the chat box so all of you can see it. And Professor Wolf will actually be streaming the video on my behalf. So thank you so much, Professor, for doing that. So once we're done watching the video, I'm gonna put you all into pairs through the breakout rooms. And in your pairs, please talk about this question. How can we use queer of color critique to understand Lundi Khoi, who is the person in this video? How can we use queer of color critique to understand her situation? And how are Cambodian deportees undesirable and queer to the United States? So there is currently an increase in the deportation of Cambodian immigrants and refugees today in the United States. So after 9/11 happened, the United States expanded its qualifications for deportations for people who have aggravated felonies, which includes nonviolent crimes like drug possessions. So as a result, a lot of poor, low-income, working-class Cambodian refugees have been routinely deported because of their previous nonviolent felons. So just wanted to share that really quickly. And now let's watch the video.
I believe I contribute to society and pay my taxes, but what keeps coming up is this felony and not about the other things that I do. In their pursuit of deporting criminal aliens, they've gone after people with very old convictions, people with minor convictions, people whose families and communities will also be devastated if they're deported.
All right, so thank you everyone for watching this video. I'm gonna go ahead and put you all into breakout rooms. I'm not sure if I have that function as a co-host, actually.
Let me see. I can go ahead and make you the host, and
Okay.
you can make me the host once we're done with the breakout rooms.
All right, so I'm gonna put you all into pairs of, I'm gonna create 11 breakout rooms, have at least 2 or 3 people together, and I'm gonna set my timer for 5 minutes. And once the 5 minutes are over, I'm gonna ask folks to share their responses to this question, either out loud or in the chat box. So 5 minutes starting now. Please join the breakout rooms.
Hello, MT.
Yes.
I'm Carolyn, and I'm captioning for Maria Rocha. I need to be put in her breakout room. So
Okay.
when you assign me, I'm not sure if you assign me to the right room.
Yes, I can assign you.
To Maria Rocha.
All right, so Maria Rocha is in room 9. So let me assign you to that. There you go.
Gurdeep and Alyssa, are you? Oh, hi, Alyssa, are you able to join a breakout room?
I'll put Alyssa in room number 4. There's currently no
I-
one there.
I'm
Oh.
on Zoom on my phone. I connected as soon as I got out of work at 5 o'clock, but now I'm home and I was able to connect on my laptop.
Okay.
So on my phone, I'm in room 8, but it doesn't show anyone else in the group. And I don't hear anything from my phone right now. Oh, it looks like I just got audio, but I can't see who's in the room in 8.
Oh, so it's Diana and Miriam.
Okay, they just started speaking, so I'll go ahead and
Okay,
connect with them.
awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa.
And I can either join or stay. It's up to you.
Oh, okay. I think room.
This is your class, right, Mary?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know. Do you think it would be beneficial if I enter? I also don't want to encroach on student space, so it just depends.
Usually don't. It's so true. It's different from face to face. Face to face, we can circulate. We can kind of
Right, yeah.
And so that's I actually don't unless they will send a request for me to join sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I'm kind of like, yeah, I'll just wait because,
Mhm.
it changes the dynamic,
It
even
does.
even
Oh
if
my
we're
God.
aware,
It
that,
totally
we don't want the authoritative professor, but it's part of the way in which students interpret us, right? So,
It
Yeah.
is.
Yeah,
Mhm.
even when I teach in person, I try not to intrude
Yeah.
when I split them up in groups. I'm kind of just there like a specter in the background.
It's tricky, right? It's like, yeah, I just like to move around. And actually, and students know that, like, they actually know that I like to move around. So they kind of but I give them, that's their zone for them to really connect and learn more about one another, and to build, community together. And so it's, in that sense, it's really sacred to me.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
repeatedly, I mean, I get that input is one of the most highly cited kind of feedback is that students really appreciate really being able to get to know each other and learn with each other, and it wouldn't be the same.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to be able to teach like smaller classes at a Cal State. to yeah, like the largest Asian American studies class I taught was 75 people, and it was extremely overwhelming, and I tried really hard to learn like all of my students' names, but alas,
Right.
it didn't happen. Yeah, so I'm
Yeah.
really
This is as big as our classes get. This is in 4,200. The 4,200, it fulfills 2 requirements. And I do, send out the permission codes and let more students join. So this, will be anywhere from 29 to 33, but that's as large as it gets.
Oh wow.
Yeah, but we do end up with a 4-4 load at some point.
Yeah.
So that's where it's overwhelming because 30 times 4 means you have about 120 students each
Mhm.
semester.
Mm.
And on top of all the other responsibilities, which include publishing and service, and it can be overwhelming, but the classes are small. And if you end up with a course release occasionally, because you're either involved with a campus committee or, some other project, then some semesters it could be 3-4 or it could be 3-3. It just depends on, but that is part of the Cal State reality often, is that it's more teaching centered. But on the bright side, it's less publishing compared to a UC. So it just depends on like where is the fit. Some people are more research oriented and want to focus on that.
Yeah.
But we'll talk more about that at the debrief.
Yeah, of course. Oh, so the breakout rooms are closing right now in 46 seconds. So I think everyone is making their way back to the larger discussion. So if you have a thought or an insight to share, please go ahead and raise your hand. I'm also gonna make Dr. Rolf the host again. Make host. There you go. So I'm just gonna check the participants list. All right, does anyone have any insights that they want to share about this question? How can we use queer of color critique to understand Lundi Koi's situation and the deportation of Cambodian refugees in the United States? How are they also queer to the nation?
If I could go ahead and say something.
Yes, please.
Okay. Our group basically talked about how, this is pretty common with all communities of color, especially, minorities. And how this applies to not just Cambodians, but everyone. There's this idea that if you don't check all the boxes or you don't represent what quote unquote community we're trying to serve, you're not gonna pass this bar. And like you were talking about earlier about the model minority myth, we could say how far we've come today, but it's still there. The effects of that whole myth is still present. And I'm not Cambodian, but I'm guessing that Cambodians probably aren't I guess thought of as the model minority like Chinese Americans are, or at least have been thought of. So there's also that. And, minorities and, Indigenous people of color are charged way more when it comes to minor offenses than, your average white cis male or whoever. And that's still present today. So that's what we basically said.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for making that broader connection across multiple groups. Does anyone else want to share what they talked about? You can also type it in the chat box and I will read it out loud.
We kind of, in my group, we kind of talked about pretty much the same thing that that previous group was talking about, but how it's just kind of, it seems like that's like a tool that's used to just get rid of people that are undesirable, I guess, like to, whatever standard that applies to. And how like it's not even across the board, how like certain groups have to worry about like that small felony. She has to worry about that for the rest of her life, whereas other people get to just live their life without ever having to think of anything like that happening to them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, the consequences of for felonies, especially even for nonviolent crimes, are definitely greater for minority communities. Yeah, so thank you everyone for participating and for sharing your insights. So I'm gonna type up my email address in the chat box. So if you have there's a comment from Guadalupe. Something like a drug offense is easily justified with the deviancy trope and justifies deportations. Yes, definitely. And Cambodians may be viewed as outsiders, just like many other peoples of color. Yes, Cambodians are seen as immigrants, but they're actually refugees. They didn't come to the United States because they planned to. It was because they were displaced from their homeland. So there is even more at stake when we think about how and why Cambodians are being deported from this nation that's supposed to provide safety, security, and sanctuary. But in a previous chat bubble, I included my email address. If you have any further questions about Asian American studies or queer of color critique, please feel free to email me. If you also have any questions about graduate school too, please email me. I'd be happy to share. I know a lot of folks are thinking about going back to school, and I'm always happy to talk to folks about master's programs or PhD programs and what it's like being an ethnic studies graduate student. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Professor Roth for allowing me to share my research with you all.
So everyone, please show your appreciation. You can unmute yourself and clap or use the reactions down below under the Hollywood Square. So thank you. This was very eye-opening, and I took a lot of notes to add on to, you know, the Asian American studies kind of content that we definitely cover in this course. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're
Yeah.
welcome.
Bye. I'll be heading out now. See ya.
Bye-bye. So everyone, wow, thank you for the super engaging and really critical analyses and conversations that you had. I mean, this is pretty high level in terms of the kind of theoretical framework that Queer of Critique brings to bear, especially with critical ethnic studies and Asian American studies content. It's very intersectional, right? It's very nuanced. And we haven't covered the terms yet. So thank you for that and for welcoming our candidate, because as you know, that whenever we participate in any kind of interviewing, and we're interviewing the prospective organization or employer as potential employees as much as the employers or the organization is interviewing us. So I think that definitely that the impression that you all have made has been really powerful. So what I want to do while it's still fresh, and I know it's 5:34, and I do telling you, engaging in it's exciting and it's a lot of work, and we are going to end early today by 6 because I am going to be joining MT for their final activity of the campus visit, which is a debrief of the day. They have been here. I greeted MT at 10 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, and I will be closing out the day with them from 6 to 7. So while it's still fresh, I am going to share the link for the student survey. It's really exciting for you all to be able to play such a central role in helping to select the next 2 faculty members in ethnic studies, because now this is the only class where a candidate will speak and do a teaching demonstration. And there are other opportunities that I'll remind you of. And with tomorrow, for example, I have the Zoom link for the research presentations from 2 to 3 that every candidate is going to be presenting. So it's in addition to the teaching, they actually present a whole talk on their research. But while it is fresh, I'm going to copy and paste the link to the survey in the chat and give you until about 5:45 to finish that in real time while it's super fresh. And then we will spend the last 15 minutes getting you set up to be able to do the first week's assignment in Unit 1. And I will explain the multiple choice reading questions and show you on Blackboard what the readings are, what your options are for accessing the readings in terms of your preferred format. And then we'll be done. And next week, we will go back to finishing the full course introduction, digging into even further into the Unit 1 content together after you've had an opportunity to go through the assignments yourself this week. And then I will also set you up for the Unit 2 content. So right now, let me go get this. Ooh, sorry about that. I'm getting the link to the survey right now. And I'm going to enter it in the chat. And it's not a long survey, and at the same time, and this is the one that literally everyone on campus who attends anything. So if it's, a lunchtime meeting, if the research demonstration and also the research talk and also the teaching demonstration. So this is the link. Please go ahead and access that now. You will have plenty of time to finish it. And if there's still more that you would like to say, you will have access to it, right, at any point, and you don't have to rush to finish it. It's just helpful to do it while it's fresh. Only fill out the portions of the survey, the questions that are relevant, that apply to you. So for us, I know for the teaching demonstration, you're definitely going to be able to speak to that. And I would say you'll definitely be able to speak to the last questions that are more open-ended on whether or not you think MT would be a good fit. So again, but it's like, as far as the research, talk, if you weren't able to attend that, then you can ignore that question, for example. So does anyone have any questions? And I'm going to mute myself and maybe play a little. We'll play on a low level, low volume. I'll play one of the selections from your playlist that you created.
razón. Me marcho, víctima de un alter ego. Me voy. Llevo en todo mi cuerpo, tatuado sobre el tiempo que te conocí. Se me hizo vicio ver tus ojos, respirar tu aliento. Me voy pero te llevo dentro de mí. Me voy pero te llevo dentro de mí. Like a rain. You're my inspiration, girl. You take me places, put the words right into these songs. Stealing kisses undercover, babe. See forever when I see your face. And I swear God made you for me. You make it easy. Loving up on you, make it easy.
So I could continue listening to the playlist. I had so much fun with these playlists. So again, thank you all for doing the input. It's going to be super valuable. And because, you know, there's a large number of you in this class, so it's going to carry, you know, some significant weight in terms of the, you know, the parts of MT's visit, final campus visit, that you were able to engage in addition to if you were able to attend anything today. So what I want to do is I want to get you set up. We're going to start practicing with Top Hat today. And I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be accessing our Blackboard course shell and going back and forth between the Blackboard course shell and Top Hat. You know, I know it's tricky to navigate between different platforms, and I think it's going to be okay. I experimented with copying and pasting full, like the full text of the readings, and it gets really long in Top Hat. So once I do have some recommendations, some suggestions, especially when you are answering the multiple choice reading questions at the start of most of the units. So the first thing I'm going to start out with is the first unit is the idea of race. I have already assigned it to you. It was not until I assigned it this afternoon. So, and I sent out a message to everyone that is also posted on the announcement section of our course shell. You have from today until next Tuesday, February 16th, end of day, 11:59 p.m. to go through this unit, to answer the multiple choice reading questions, and there are 5 of them, and then to go through the PowerPoint, the presentation itself with all of the integrated activities. Now, again, we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to do some in-class discussions around this unit, and I want to have a little bit of time to get it set up for you in terms of the idea of race, as well as the background of the first 4 to 5 units are out of a book by scholar Claire Rodriguez, who does the most intensive, the most in-depth, and the most comprehensive analysis and picking apart of every US census from 1890, which is the date of the very first US census that was administered, through 2010. She did not have access, obviously, to the 2020 census when she was doing this research. She also draws from the research of other scholars. So this is a great, powerful example of how ethnic studies is a very interdisciplinary field. And so she's not just kind of, in addition to, and we're going to look at all different types of history and current events and other types of research and scholarship and the readings from political science, from sociology, from ethnic studies, and from anthropology, as well as looking into education, especially around the school to prison pipeline. So she's doing this so that she can really, really unpack why race became such a cornerstone and continues to be, right, such a core way of not only organizing society in the United States, but also in how it sets up a system of marginalization and oppression versus privilege and entitlement. So she gets into the way that the US codifies race in the US Census. It's really fascinating, and it's a very methodical, systematic exploration from the time when the US first was, like I said, was 1790, actually 1790 was the first census. So from the first census is 1790, after the Constitutional Congress met in Philadelphia, and the US Constitution was ratified in 1789. So then the very next year, the first US Federal Congress had already created the US Census Bureau and had assigned them this task of doing a count, right? And all like societies have done this for a very long time. So Clara Rodriguez unpacks what that has led to, what that created, what practices and what policies were then instituted as a result of this way of counting the population and different segments of the population, and then also how that persists to the current day. So this is a great foundation to understanding. The first core concept is that race is a social construction. This means that it is not a biological category, social eugenics notwithstanding. Beliefs that still persist about human beings literally having different degrees of intelligence, of character, of morality, of beauty, of goodness, based on physical traits. The primary one being skin color, because our skin is the largest organ that we on our bodies, and it's the one that's the most immediately visible. So you're going to learn from the four-field anthropological approach, and specifically from evolutionary genetics, who have researched and studied, well, then where does skin color come from? What are the genetic, right? What are the genes or the little cluster of genes that determine skin color? And what does it mean? So this is going to be a recurring truth that we're going to continuously revisit and emphasize. Race is a social construction, and it's a very powerful one, right? It's a very powerful one. Every aspect of human life, culture is a social construction. Family is a social construction. Gender identities are a social construction. Sexual orientations are a social construction. Religion is a social construction, right? So it's all social constructions because of how we're evolved. So we'll get into that more next week. What I want to do now is I want to do a dry run in the less than 10 minutes that we have left of, and definitely log in. So I'm going to assign, in order to present the first unit, some of the slides, which means that you will not be able to see it right now. So that's the funny thing about Top Hat. as long as I'm presenting, you won't have access to it. So I will reassign it once we're done today. One of my favorite features is that it automatically takes attendance. So what I will begin doing starting next Tuesday is before, in the 10 to 15 minutes before we begin class, I will open up the attendance, and every week a different 4-digit attendance code is generated just for our class session, just for that week. And so what I will do before we start class is I will copy and then paste. See if I can get to it. Where is it? I may have, so I'll go, so I'm gonna paste today's in the chat. Today's attendance code is, so I have 2379 in the chat. And for those of you who would like the option of texting the attendance code directly from your phone, then you can text it to this phone number that begins with the 315 area code. So then I'm going to enter that in the chat. Oh, there we go. And this will have the full, and this is what I'm going to do before we start class moving forward. Now, obviously it wasn't, we're going to be in Top Hat during MT's teaching demonstration. And what I do throughout the duration of our time together is I have the option of either finishing it or minimizing it, keeping it open so it doesn't block the screen. So I minimize and I keep it open. So you're going to have from now and the next 6 minutes to enter the attendance code directly into Top Hat or by texting it from your phone. Now, it is going to be necessary if you have not subscribed to Top Hat yet, it is going to be necessary to do that so that you will be able to access the assignments for Unit 1 this week. So we're starting out with the idea of race in the US and what that looks like. And with this unit in particular, so you're going to have an opportunity to speak to, well, the US, and this is my addition that I realized ever since I started teaching ethnic studies at the university level in 2012. The US social construction of race is like a box of Crayola crayons. And what you will learn is doing a deep dive into what Clara Rodriguez characterizes as somatic, bodily, physical attributes. So the difference, and that's the primary difference. We're going to get into the difference between race and ethnicity. The primary difference between race versus ethnicity is race is a construction that is based completely on physical appearance, physical traits, somatic. And then everyone is grouped based on their closeness or their distance from the physical the group classified as superior, which is those classified as white, but nobody's actually white, right? Everyone has some degree of pigmentation in their skin because you have to have it, and you'll learn why. I mean, in relation to the degree of exposure to ultraviolet radiation from the sun. You'll learn more about that in this unit. So we're gonna dig into these into this unit a little bit more next week before we set up unit set up unit 2 for next week. So what I want to do is point out reading questions. The instructions for the reading questions are here, as you can see, and this is just the instructions. And it's very important that you have access to this. So these are 5 multiple choice questions that come directly from chapter 2, the idea of race. Now, this reading is located in the documents and it's actually in the I'll show you, it's in the modules because it's I'm getting ready to shift over to Canvas on our Blackboard course shell. So what I suggest is that you open up, you access the reading that goes with each unit, and each unit is actually named after the title of the reading. So the idea of race is literally named after Clara Rodriguez's chapter 2 in her book. And there will be, these 5 questions come directly verbatim from the reading. So this is a way to recognize that we are all very busy. I know that it's hard to juggle having all work being pushed 100% remote. There was a lot of this work that I would do in class with my students, right? It's all been pushed 100% remote for the most part. So I believe that it's important to recognize that this is work, right? This is part of the class. And so I like to have no more than 5 multiple choice reading questions, because I at least want you to introduce yourself to the reading. I at least want you to skim over it, and to also recognize that that is part of the work of scholarship. That is part of the work of learning. And that's why each multiple choice question is worth 2 points based on accuracy, based on correctness, for a total of 10 possible points. And the reason why I have these questions right before you go into the PowerPoint presentations and assignments that emphasize and pull out key concepts and theories and terms from each chapter is so that you are not just starting cold, right? I call it priming the pump. You want to get warmed up before you start doing a deep dive into the PowerPoint assignments. So I'm going to show you where to find this before I go to the chat. And I know we only have 1 minute left. So I definitely want to show this to you so you know exactly where to go. So I have the readings organized based on modules that also are the exact same as the different parts of the course as they appear on the syllabus. And then I've also organized the units in Top Hat with the same name. So part A is the production of race and ethnicity, unit A, or part A materials. Well, the first thing is the part A materials. You go to the part A readings. And as you can see here, the very first reading is chapter 2, Clara Rodriguez. The very first unit, the idea of race. The very first unit, which is aligned with the first reading, the name of the unit in Top Hat is the idea of race. You have 2 options. For the readings that are in PDF form, and this is actually a link to a website, so you're going to go directly to the website to access the American Anthropological Statement on Race. So you have the option of accessing the document in PDF form. The issue with PDF is you can save a copy, but unless you have Acrobat Reader, you can't really do anything with the document. You can't underline anything. You can't highlight anything, right? So I've added, when it's compatible, when I reformat from PDF to Word and it's legible, you have the option of downloading the reading in Word. You can save your own copy of the reading in Word. And if I can get, okay. So the benefit of this is you will have your own personal copy. So you have this open. And then as you are going through each individual multiple choice reading question in Top Hat, so here's question 1. And it's not timed. There's no restriction on how long this takes. So, whoops, I'm kind of giving you the answer. So, but anyway, that's okay. So, okay, no, that's just an option. That's not actually the correct answer. So these are the multiple choice questions. And it says Rodriguez, and I still have each reading multiple choice question labeled as well. So you know exactly which chapter it's referencing. Clara Rodriguez uses this document to study race in the US. 4 choices, 1 is the correct choice. So I suggest as you are going through each multiple choice reading question, you also go back, go to, for example, the Word document, or if the PDF document is sufficient. And so, for example, you would be reading through, skimming through. I mean, like you probably do it. I'm skimming through. until you find the, I mean, and it's very straightforward because I mean, basically what she's studying is the census. And so, so that's how I suggest answering the reading multiple choice questions. Going to Blackboard, our Blackboard course shell, going to and so this is part A materials, the production of race and ethnicity. When you go to the Blackboard course shell, readings, module 1, part A, the production of race and ethnicity. So all of the readings that match, the units in Top Hat are named exactly the same name. They have the same title in Blackboard. Does anyone have any questions? I know it's 6:03. So I want you to really focus on doing the first unit. I know that we didn't get as much time to do an overview. We're going to get to do some really great discussions after we finish the course introduction next week. I will reassign this for you so that you will have access to it. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to email me directly. And yeah, I'm really excited about you taking, getting into this content, getting into this material, and about our unpacking it a little bit more next week before we go on to Unit 2. So does anyone have any questions for right now before we log off? Okay, thank you again. I'm going to re-sign the Blackboard, the Top Hat Unit 1 for you. And then I'm going to go to meet with MT again, and I will see you next week.